Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Toyster. It's great to have you here. We're talking about a fun topic for me today, how the 4 stages of competency can help you train faster. Essentially, we're talking about the learning curve. And I love this topic. There's 3 specific questions I want to try to answer for you today. Question number 1, how to identify where someone is on the learning curve. Question number 2, what do your learning participants need from you at each stage along the curve? And finally, how can you tell if someone is not trainable? So this broadcast today is perfect if you are a trainer. This is designed for you. If you're a manager or supervisor, maybe you don't call yourself a trainer, but you lead and develop other people, this can help you as well. So welcome to everyone. Once again, if you have a question you'd like me to answer, please share it as a comment. I will do my best to answer on the live broadcast. If I don't get a chance to answer then, or you're watching the recording, that's okay too. I will periodically follow up after the broadcast and answer as best I can. So I want to share with you how I discovered this concept. And sometimes challenge is how we learn lessons, and sometimes we learn those lessons the hard way. Years ago, I was managing a training department for a contact center, and we would train hundreds and hundreds of people every year. Most of them were new hires, and I was in a challenging position. The reason my position was so challenging was because our human resources department hired a lot of people that should never have been hired. And they did this because their success was evaluated based upon the number of people they hired, not whether or not those people were qualified. So if they had to hire 30 new contact center agents and they put 30 names on the roster, they were considered successful. My challenge was then, as new hires, we got a lot of people who couldn't do the job, who should never have been hired. But my success was evaluated based upon whether or not those new hires could do the job once they graduated from the training department. So I had to learn quickly about this learning curve, but more specifically, the 4 stages of competency. And this is a lesson I'm going to share with you today. So let's start by doing a little demonstration. And if you will, I'm going to ask you, when I say go, just clap your hands together 3 times. And on the 3rd clap, leave your hands together. And I'll tell you why we're doing this in just a moment. So let's do this. Let's clap our hands together 3 times. Ready? Go. Now, I want you to leave your hands together because I want you to notice where your hands are. All of us have a natural way of clapping our hands without even thinking about it. For me, my left hand is on top, so it's on your right side of your screen, but it's my left. It's on top, and my right hand's on the bottom. That's just how I naturally clap my hands. Now, you might be a little different. That's okay. I want you to notice how you naturally clap your hands without even thinking. Now we're going to do just a little tiny tweak here. I want you to reverse your hands. So for me, with my left hand is on top, now I'm going to put that hand on the bottom and I'm going to put my right hand on top. Maybe for you, reversing it is a little different. That's okay. I just want you to reverse your hands from the way you would normally clap. And this time we're going to clap our hands together 3 times with our hands reversed. Now, before we do this, you might notice your brain is sending you a little signal right now. And it's saying, hey, this feels a little weird. And that's okay. We're going to lean into that. Using our hands in the reverse position, let's try clapping 3 times. On go. Ready? Go. Okay, I bet you were able to do that. But yet again, I think most of you probably felt just a little something in your brain that's telling you this is not normal. It's a little uncomfortable. That feeling is essential for people to learn new skills. And it's essential to identify where your learners are on the learning curve. It's that feeling. Now, some training classes, the feeling is no more than this. It's very subtle. Other times, the feeling is very extreme. It's extremely uncomfortable. As learners, though, if you are not feeling this little bit of discomfort, learning can't happen. And it's our job as trainers to figure out where people are on the learning curve and when they start feeling that discomfort. And I hate to tell you this, as trainers, part of our job is to cause that discomfort. We have to put learners in a situation where they're feeling just a little uncomfortable. Otherwise, they can't learn. So let's dive into the learning curve. I've got an image that I want to share with you here. And you could probably see that the traditional learning curve we think of as a function of ability and time. Over time, you increase your ability. But when you break it down and look at it as specific stages, then we get a little bit more detailed. And I want to share that with you now, what these 4 stages might look like. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. The 4 stages are called the 4 stages of competency. And this idea, I think, was first popularized by Noel Birch in the 1970s. And the idea is that we move through different stages as learners. And so I want to walk you through each of these stages, and then we'll go back to those 3 questions I said I was going to answer for you. So stage number 1 is called unconscious incompetent. And what this simply means is that unconscious, I'm not aware, and incompetent, I can't do it. Now, incompetent seems like it's a mean term, and we mean this in a very clinical sense here. So when learners start, they're not aware of what they can't do. And as trainers, we often call this the bliss stage. So the start of a class or a learning event, people are excited, maybe a little nervous, but mostly excited. I'll give you an example. Most of you probably know how to drive, and you were in that unconscious incompetent stage right before you started behind the wheel in your driver training. Now, if you don't know how to drive, I'm sorry that this exercise or this example doesn't relate to you, but this is where you would be if you were to start driver's training, which is unconscious incompetent. You don't know what you don't know. Now, as learners progress from stage 1 to stage 2, which is conscious incompetent, they're aware of it. In other words, they're conscious and they cannot do it. Now, for those of you who learned to drive, this was probably a very specific moment. For me, I learned to drive on a manual transmission vehicle. And so my specific moment was the first time I put it in gear and I tried to move forward and the car shuddered and then stalled. Oh, now I am suddenly very aware that I cannot yet drive a car. And for others, it might have been the first time you tried to merge into traffic or change lanes when there was a car in your blind spot. You got nervous, you weren't sure what to do, or maybe you tried to pull out too fast and your driver's ed instructor had you slam on the brakes. It's that moment when you realize you can't do it. Now, in a learning environment of any kind, we need people to move from I don't know what I don't know to I know what I don't know in order for them to learn. Now, stage 3, conscious competent, you can do it, but you are very, very aware of it. And remember we did the hand clapping? That's a stage 3 right there. In other words, you could clap your hands, but you were a little too aware of it. In drivers, when you were learning to drive, that's when you took your driving test. And that person with the clipboard was right next to you and you were nervous and you thought about every move you made because you wanted to pass the test. And you did pass it. And that says you were competent. You can do it, but you were too aware of it. And this is a dangerous time for learners because they might say, even though they're successful, they might say, this doesn't feel natural. This feels uncomfortable. Let's say I was to convince you that clapping your hands the opposite way was much more efficient and much better and had all of these amazing benefits. You would still feel at some level, it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel right. I'm more comfortable clapping my hands this way. And here learners are really vulnerable to going back to their old habits. Now, this last stage, this is conscious, unconscious, competent. You can do it without thinking. And for many of us, that's how we drive today. Getting from A to B, I don't even know how I got there. I know I just did. And this is where we're trying to eventually get our learners along the learning curve. So I want to answer some questions for you around this, which is question number 1, how do we figure out where someone is on the curve? Because as a trainer or as a manager or supervisor, people need to have a different strategy. They need different things from us depending on where they are along the curve. So I want to share this with you. I find it easier to lay out the curve in a slightly different way, because the learning curve really is the intersection of two things. It's ability, can I do it or not? And awareness, am I aware or not? And we can answer two questions to figure out exactly where someone is along the learning curve. So question number one, this is ability. Can they do it? And if they cannot do it, then they are technically incompetent. Again, we wouldn't say this to the learner, hey, you're incompetent. That might make them feel bad. But as a trainer, that is something that's very important for us to identify. So question number one, can they do it? Question number two, are they aware of the skill while they're demonstrating it? So we'll go back to my new hire class. When we got our new hires and people were unconscious incompetent, they were excited. It was the first day on the job. And then we started doing exercises and activities. And that would cause a little bit of failure. They could do some of it, but it would cause a little bit of failure. So they went from, I'm not aware of it and I can't do it, to I can't do it and I'm aware of it. And you will often see learners exhibit uncertainty or be a little bit concerned about their performance. In fact, some learners decide to leave entirely. Earlier, I told you that one of the challenges for our training department was we receive people as new hires that should never have been hired. And on day one, we had a lot of people show up for class, and after the first break or after lunch, they never came back. Why? Because they suddenly realized that they were not going to be able to do this job, and they left. And that's a danger sometimes for learners. Other times learners will say, I don't know if I can do it. And that's where the trainer will have to give them a little bit more support. We'll talk about that in a moment. But as they move along the curve, now they move towards ability. And the transition from stage two, conscious incompetent, to conscious competent, that's not an abrupt one. Typically, it's more of it's back and forth a little bit. You can do it. Oh, there's a setback. You can do it better now. The more you practice, you learned it, you made a revision. But it's a little bit of back and forth. And so at stage three, conscious competent, can they do it? Yes. Are they aware of it? Yes, they are too aware of it. It's very uncomfortable. Finally, we get to stage four. They can do it. They're not even thinking about how they do it. So again, how do we figure out where someone is on a learning curve? We have to observe them. And this is a key thing, I think, for a lot of people in training. Especially when we've gone online now, we think, well, Zoom can handle 200 participants, so let's train 200 people at once. As a trainer, the maximum class size, if I'm doing live training, has always been dependent on how well I can answer those two questions. What is the maximum number of people I can answer those two questions about in my training environment? Now, for a complicated job like a call center representative, our maximum class size was 8, because that was about the max that a trainer could handle to look at all 8 participants and say, can they do it? Are they aware of it? Now, I've trained other skills, presentation skills, for example, where the class size went up to 14, or communication skills where it went up to 20. The point of determination here was, can they do it? And are they aware of it? Once the class got so big that I could not answer those 2 questions about all of the participants, the class was too large, and we had to go smaller to ensure the training was effective. So often we're asked to answer this question around class size, and class size is really dependent on our ability to recognize where each learner is on the learning curve. Because if you cannot recognize where people are on the learning curve, it's hard as a trainer to facilitate learning, because we have to give learners a little bit of different types of training depending on where they are on the curve. And that's what I want to talk about next. What do participants need from you depending on where they are on the curve? So let's bring this back up. I'll make it a little bit bigger. When I was running this training department, I happened to take a course called Situational Leadership 2. It was a leadership course originally designed by Ken Blanchard. And it really set off a light bulb for me, because in this course, I learned that this basic model of leadership was adapting your style of leadership based upon what your direct reports needed from you. And there were simply two components. How much direction did you give, and how much support or encouragement did you give? The light bulb moment for me was realizing this leadership model aligned directly with this learning curve. And so I'm going to change I'm going to take away awareness and direction for just a moment, and I'm going to change it to support. And changing the model just a little bit, this is how we figure out what people need from us when it comes to as a trainer or even a leader. And so the stages are still in the same place, but instead of awareness and ability, I've replaced that with direction and support. And let's look at each stage. Stage one, unconscious incompetent. They don't know what they don't know. So they don't need encouragement from us right now. But what they do need is a lot of direction, because they don't know what to do yet. So we go back to driver's training. The first time you get behind the wheel, you're already excited. You don't need someone to encourage you, but you do need someone to tell you what to do, how to put the car in gear, how to pull forward, how to check for traffic, when to put your blinker on. You don't know these things yet, so you need a lot of direction. Now, once we give learners direction, they move into the conscious incompetent stage. Now that's when the fear sets in. That's when the worry, pride is on the line. They don't know how to do it, so they still need a lot of direction from us as trainers, but they also need support, and they also need encouragement. And so when I was running this training department, we had people that were marginal. They struggled a lot more than others. We had to offer a lot of clear direction, but also a lot of support. And for those people we were not able to give enough support to, they might resign. They might leave the organization if we didn't give them enough support. Now, as we move into conscious competent, we don't need to give them as much direction anymore, because they know how to do it. But remember when we were doing the hand clapping and it felt weird? It didn't feel natural. It's because we hadn't developed it as a rote skill yet. And so that feeling of it's unnatural or it's uncomfortable requires us as trainers to still give support. We just don't have to give direction. So for driving, for example, that might be the time when you merge onto a busy highway and you were really nervous and the cars were going too fast, but you did it. And so the driving instructor didn't need to say to you, this is how to do it. You could do it, but they did need to say to you, you handled that well. It gives you that confidence. You're doing it. You're okay. Now, finally, when we get to this last stage, unconscious competent, as trainers, now we have to back off. We don't need to give them much direction. We don't need to give them much support. And we'll go back to driving once more. If you're driving today and you're an expert driver and you've been driving for years, if your passenger suddenly starts telling you how to drive, that's annoying. Or if they start encouraging, hey, I really like the way you made that right turn, that's also annoying. And for our learners, it's kind of the same thing. Once they reach the stage where they could do things without thinking of it, we don't really need to disrupt them, other than to perhaps occasionally point out something they're doing well or occasionally support them, but they just don't need much from us. So identifying what someone needs from you depends on those two questions we asked earlier. Can they do it? If they cannot do it, they need direction. If they can do it, they do not need direction. Are they aware of it? That's the second question. If they are not aware of it, they don't need support. If they are aware of it, they definitely need support and encouragement. So that is how we can determine where someone is along the learning curve and alter what we do for them as they go along the way. Now, I want to answer one more question for you, which is how to tell if someone is not trainable. And as I do, if you're tuning in to the live broadcast, if you have a question about the learning curve or the 4 stages of competency, I invite you to ask that now, as we're running a little bit low on time. And if you're watching this as a recording, go ahead and share your question, and I'll check back periodically and respond to you then. So here's one of the challenges that I faced, and one of the worst parts of my job when I was supervising this training department. Occasionally, we would have someone who was not trainable. not only were they not trainable, they just wouldn't recognize it and they wouldn't quit voluntarily. But my department, we were evaluated based upon whether or not someone left our training department and they were able to do the job. And so the worst part of my job was I had to sit down with people who had just been hired but never should have been. And I had to tell them they were fired. And I never, ever forgot that. But I also made sure that before I had to sit down with someone and have that very difficult conversation, that I exhausted all opportunities and I was crystal clear with objective information as to why they could not do the job. And so I want to share that with you as this final piece of the puzzle. Go back to this hand clap. Okay, this felt different, right? When we clapped our hands using the opposite hand. That's natural. That's a very natural and normal part of learning. How to tell if someone's not trainable is when someone's not doing it correctly and they think they are. So to give you a hand clap example, if you were doing this, hey, I'm clapping my hands, there's no sound, your hands aren't moving, and you're like, I'm great at hand clapping. That's a clear sign that someone is not trainable. We'll go back to this learning curve for just a moment and these 4 stages. And if you notice that in these stages, unconscious and competent, if someone does not leave that stage, they are not trainable. Now, I want to give you the example of how we handled this in my call center training department. And hopefully you can relate to this in your own organization or your own training. Now, day one for most new hires, quickly they fell into conscious incompetent. They realized they couldn't do it. And that's when they needed some support for the trainer, but they also were engaged in the learning process. But occasionally there were a couple of people who were still very excited, yet they consistently could not complete the exercises. And so at that case, that's when the trainer would sit down with them. And remember, what do we need to give them? We need to give people a lot of direction when they're unable to do something. So the trainer would give a lot of clear feedback, a lot of direction. And some people would say, I get it now. And they'd start to make improvements. And other people would say, I'm all right. And they would keep doing the exercises and they would keep failing. Now, the second stage that the trainer would get to then is if they kept failing, instead of giving them feedback, instead of giving them a lot of coaching, the trainer would actually back off and stop giving them any coaching and stop giving them any support or direction. And the reason for doing this was we wanted the person to experience that failure you have to experience before you can move forward with learning. And it might feel a little harsh, but it did a couple of things. Sometimes people said, whoa, now that you're not giving me all this feedback, I realize this is a lot harder than I thought. I'm going to opt out, and that's okay. Other times people said, whoa, now that you're not giving me all this feedback, I realize this is a lot harder. I now know what I need to do different. And sometimes those people would improve their performance and they became trainable. But occasionally, someone would still say, I'm doing great. And that is when we knew someone was not trainable. When they repeatedly fail and they still are convinced that they are doing it well or they're fantastic, that person has not moved from unconscious incompetent to conscious incompetent. There's nothing we can do to train them. And unfortunately, those are the people that in my role as a young supervisor, I had to let go. So we covered a lot today. I want to make sure that we leave some time for any questions that you might have about the 4 stages of competency or just the learning curve in general, whether it's assessing where people are in the learning curve, deciding what you need to do as a trainer, or even to figure out what it is that will tell you this person cannot be trained. So I'll give you a moment to think of what questions you might have. I want to give you one more piece of advice when it comes to this learning curve. And specifically, it's what do we do when we're digital or virtual, or when people are completing e-learning and we don't have as much interaction with them as a facilitator? We still have to find ways to answer those 2 questions. Can they do it? Yes or no? If we're not asking that question, we're not facilitating learning. Only when we're able to tell, can this person demonstrate the ability or apply the knowledge or demonstrate that they've learned something, only when they do that can we tell that learning is occurring. And then the second question is awareness. This is feedback from our learners. And what does that look like? Well, it might be a learner directly saying, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm nervous, or I'm not sure. When we're getting this feedback from our learners, this tells us, are they aware or not? So making sure you answer those two questions, even if you're on Zoom or some other platform, you still have to make sure you can answer those questions. And if you can't, it's really difficult to facilitate learning. All right, so we do have a couple of questions. One person's asking, Paul's asking about a recording for this. It's already being recorded. So this post that you're listening to, as soon as we're done with the recording today, that LinkedIn post will become the recording. And I think it's the upper right-hand corner of the post. There's a couple of dots. If you click on that, you will get a link to be able to share that with your team, etc. So another question here, and I think we've got a couple around here. How do we make e-learning effective? And one of the challenges with e-learning is if we don't have that ability as facilitators to answer those two questions. And the way that we make that effective really is we have to build that into the e-learning. So we have to build in assessments into the e-learning. And if we can't do that because of the topic, then we have to build that into a blended approach where e-learning becomes one tool in the process, but we also have some coaching or live training. If we can build assessments in the e-learning, we also need to build encouragement. So often you'll see things in e-learning as simple as if you complete an exercise, hey, you did it. Or if you do an exercise wrong in e-learning, hey, that was a good shot, but let's try this a different way. Building that encouragement into the e-learning design is a way of helping to give participants some of that encouragement that they're going to need. But if you have e-learning that is just complete these steps with no learning checks involved, that's not really e-learning. That's just content. All right, great question. I think someone wanted to be, Amal wanted to ask, how do we go from conscious incompetence? So again, moving from conscious incompetence is making it very clear to the learner that they cannot do it. So you have to do something in the training where they have to apply skills they do not have. It's a challenge, or it's an exercise, or it's an activity that highlights, here's what you're expected to do. And some sort of challenge, some sort of failure is necessary for them to make the adjustment. Again, sometimes that's really, really small. If it's an easy skill, this is not going to be a big deal for the learner. On the other hand, if it's really, really difficult, then it's going to be a tough skill. And it's going to be a lot harder for the learner. So it's all about exercises where they apply the skills they need to learn. And that's the opportunity for them to figure out, what do I know already? And where do I still need to grow? All right, here's another question we got from John. Let's talk about timing. So this idea that everyone can learn and anyone can learn is unfortunately not quite correct. Many people can learn. However, a lot of people either don't have the physical ability or they don't have the willingness. And as a trainer, we have to regard that as a little bit of the same way. And so I can tell you from experience training thousands and thousands of people that learning is not something that everyone can do for a particular topic. There's some people, for example, that will never be great at being a customer service agent. It's just not part of their skill sets. Or they just really dislike it so much they never want to do it. And this learning curve is a good way of helping our learners and participants figure that out. I know that we're running short on time, so as more questions are coming in, I'm going to respond to those offline. I want to make sure we end on time today, so I will say this. I thank you all for tuning in. Keep an eye on the comments stream for this broadcast. I will follow up online and get to as many questions as I can. If you're watching the recording, you can keep answering questions or asking questions, and I'll follow up there. But I hope you gained something valuable and useful. The very top of this post, I posted a link to my LinkedIn learning courses on adult learning. And I invite you to use that course to take a deeper dive into today's topic, as well as others regarding learning. Thank you so much for being part of today's broadcast, and I hope to connect with you again really soon.